Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, the Kashmiri separatist leader Yasin Malik was awarded 2 life sentences by a special National Investigation Agency court. Malik was convicted on charges of carrying out terrorist and secessionist activities in 2016 to 2017. At one point, Malik had been very popular among the youth in the valley, and after he was awarded this sentence, hundreds of men and women took to the streets in Srinagar and raised slogans in his favor. The protesters also threw stones at the police and paramilitary forces deployed in the city. Now, Yasin Malik, with his militant and violent history, has had many cases pending against him. And they have remained pending for a long time, partly because the Indian government in the past had been trying to engage with him and was trying to use him to their advantage. In fact, in a 2001 BBC interview, he himself talks about these pending cases.
How many did you kill?
It is not the matter how many you will kill.
This is the question I'm asking you.
The matter is simple that there are cases against me pending in the court, and now 11 years have passed, and Government of India has not even started the trial.
Now 20 years later, one of those cases has been heard, and Malik is on his way to spend the rest of his life in jail. In this episode, we take a look at who Yasin Malik is, the significance of this sentence that has been awarded to him, and why the Indian establishment had been engaging with him in the past. And for this, we first speak to Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwary. Deeptiman, for those who may not know or may not have heard of him, how would you describe Yasin Malik?
See, Yasin Malik initially started as a student activist in Kashmir in the mid-80s. By late 80s, he went to Pakistan. And that was the time when militancy was rising in Kashmir. And lots of people from Kashmir had actually crossed over and gone to Muzaffarabad. He was among them. He went to Pakistan and got arms training and came back as an armed militant. And he joined the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, which had actually been founded in 1976 in Birmingham, UK, by Maqbool Bhatt, who sort of became a legend martyr in Kashmir later after he was hanged by the court of law in India. So he joined Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, and he has been active in Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front since around 1988. And he was involved in a number of both criminal and terrorist activities as part of Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front.
Yeah, and he also later headed this organization, the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, which essentially is a militant separatist organization, right? As in it wants Kashmir to be a separate state, a separate nation of its own.
Yeah, so its goal was liberation of Kashmir from so-called Indian occupation. Basically, they wanted Azad Kashmir, as they continue to say till date. So JKLF was a militant organization which wanted secession of Kashmir from India. And to achieve that goal, they committed a number of terror activities, which included killing of a number of people in Kashmir. Some very, very famous personalities, such as retired Sessions Judge N.K. Ganju in 1989, when there was a spate of killings of Kashmiri Hindus, which led to what we know as the Kashmiri Pandit Exodus. He has also been involved in a number of Kashmiri Pandit killings. Then most famously, he was involved in the 1989 kidnapping of Rubaiya Saeed, the daughter of then Union Home Minister Mufti Muhammad Saeed, who later on went on to become the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir. And during this kidnapping, India had to release terrorists to secure the safety of Rubaiya Saeed. Then he was also said to be involved in killing of 4 Indian Air Force personnel in the early part of the 1990s. A case against him in this regard is still going on. So during that period, he was arrested multiple times. There are innumerable cases of both normal crime and terrorism against him. which have been pending since then. In between, the Indian establishment started negotiating with him, especially after he abjured violence in 1994 and started saying that he was now going to struggle for liberation of Kashmir in the Gandhian way, basically saying that in a democratic way through protests and other peaceful means of protest in a democracy.
Right, and because the Indian establishment started engaging with him after he renounced violence and took to the Gandhian way of life, supposedly, this is the reason why the cases that were pending against him, like the ones related to kidnapping, terrorism, and the killing of Indian Air Force officers, all of them were basically put on the back burner.
Yeah, so they thought that he was of more value outside of jail than inside, of more value as a free man than as a convicted man or a sentenced man. At that time, Indian establishment was engaging with a lot of people, which included Mirwais Umar Farooq, Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani of the Hurriyat, and several other separatist leaders who had always said that there would be no compromise on liberation of Kashmir from India. In fact, what we know of that Indian establishment when former Raw Chief A.S. Dulat was handling Kashmir, he even offered Mirwais Umar Farooq chief ministership, that if you want to become chief minister, we'll help you become one. It didn't materialize, that's another matter. So that was the kind of engagement that Indian establishment was having with the separatists at that time, and that is why most of his cases were kept on the back burner. And those were times when separatist leaders in Kashmir would flit between Pakistan and India at ease, and they had been given a lot of liberties. In fact, many people in the Indian security establishment say that, for a long period of time, the separatists had a great time because they were getting money both from Pakistan and India. And Indian establishment has even helped Hizbul Mujahideen chief Sayyid Salahuddin get his sons admitted to medical colleges.
And why did the Indian establishment decide to take this approach of engaging with people who were former militants and separatists as a way to deal with the Kashmir issue?
Look, it's very simple. Let's understand it this way. In geopolitics, for example, Russia is invading Ukraine. There is nothing anyone can do. The only thing that you can do is engage. So when your enemy is in a state that you cannot defeat it immediately, you try to engage it so that you can cut the losses and probably restore peace. You can catch a pickpocket and put him in jail. That's easy. Also because they had public sentiment behind them. So when there is a public sentiment behind some issue or some people, it becomes a political issue. So it is always wiser to engage politically. We have done this in the Northeast. Today we are talking with NSC and IM. Haven't they killed people? They have killed many, many people. Okay. We are engaging with so many insurgent groups in the Northeast. And over the years, over decades, we have done this. That's how we have won the war in the Northeast. Because we have brought everybody into the mainstream. We have said that, okay, fine, you have a political issue for which you are fighting, you have picked up a gun. We will address this political issue. Why don't you come? We'll give you some autonomy. Why don't you fight elections? Why don't you get some administrative powers? And you run your place the way you want to. You don't have to secede from India. It was in that vein that India was even engaging with Kashmir separatists at that time. The only difference is that there is a Pakistan angle here. There was no Pakistan angle in the Northeast. So if somebody comes forward to engage with you in the Northeast, they do so genuinely.
Yeah, there is no other bordering country that we have such disputes going on with. There is no country that is also funding terrorism there.
Exactly. So in Kashmir, what happens? You come to engage with Indian government. There is somebody who starts pulling strings with you. There have been people who have been killed. Sajjad Lone's father wanted to engage with India. He was shot dead by terrorists. So there is a genuine fear. There is a Pakistan angle. So that was the Kashmir cauldron because of which this pot has never stopped simmering. And India hasn't had the kind of success that it has had in the Northeast in this zone because there is a foreign country which is involved in fomenting trouble. So that's been basically the reason why India has always tried to engage or is not engaging right now, because it feels that all its efforts over the years and over decades have really not given it the kind of results that it wanted.
Okay, so we have established that because the Indian state had been engaging with such leaders in the past, the cases against Malik had been pending. But just talking about Malik himself, is there anything that stood out about him as a separatist leader?
In fact, he was a fiery young leader, of course. And that is what endeared him to the youth in Kashmir at that time. And he gave effect to some daring terrorist acts which made him very popular among the young. And he made statements and speeches which appealed to the youth, which kept him popular. In fact, his popularity started dwindling after he started professing that he had become a Gandhian.
Yeah, in fact, when the daughter of India's then Home Minister Mufti Muhammad Saeed was kidnapped, that time he became quite popular, right?
Yeah, he became a hero. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the case because of which Malik has been awarded life imprisonment. What exactly is this case about?
Look, in 2017, the National Investigation Agency registered an overarching terror funding case in which it accused Hizbul Mujahideen Sayyid Salahuddin and Lashkar-e-Taiba Hafiz Saeed of fomenting trouble in Kashmir Valley by funding separatist leaders. And basically, the FIR said that these separatist leaders received money from Pakistan, including from Hafiz Saeed and Sayyid Salahuddin, to organize stone pelting, to burn down schools, to organize strikes and protests. And a lot of people lost their lives in these incidents or were injured in these incidents, including civilians and security forces. People like Dukhtarane Millat's Asya Andrabi, Shabbir Shah. Several other people were made accused in this case and subsequently arrested. In 2019, Yasin Malik was also arrested, and NIA claimed that he organized protest calendars which gave dates on which protests would be held and stone pelting would be done, and these stone pelters were given money to pelt stones, and this money had actually come from Pakistan, and the money had links with terror groups such as LET and Hizbul Mujahideen. And that this basically took place in the wake of the killing of Hizbul Mujahideen operative Burhan Wani in 2016. And throughout 2016 and 17, there was massive unrest in the valley that we all are aware of, daily stone peltings and pellet guns being fired by security forces. So the basic premise of NIA case was that all these protests and all these stone peltings had led to loss of lives, had led to lot of injuries to both civilians and security forces. In fact, there were 89 cases of stone pelting which were reported in 2016 following the killing of Burhan Wani, which NIA claims were orchestrated by Malik. So it is in this case that Malik has been convicted, actually based on Malik himself pleading guilty to the charges. Now, we don't know why he has pleaded guilty to the charges, what is the deal that has been struck, because generally plea bargains are done when there is a deal between the accused and the government or the prosecuting agency. One can safely assume that probably it was to save him from the gallows that he agreed to plead guilty to the charges that NIA pressed against him.
And Deeptiman, what did the court have to say when it looked at this evidence that was presented by the National Investigation Agency?
So in March, the court, while framing the charges in this matter, said that it has been established that Shabbir Shah, Yasin Malik, Rashid Engineer, Altaf Pantush, Masarrat Alam, and several other such leaders were direct recipients of terror funds. The court also said that they were part of a criminal conspiracy to organize large-scale protests, resulting in violence and arson at a massive scale. And it said that Yasin Malik had set up an elaborate structure and mechanism across the world to raise funds for carrying out terrorist and other unlawful activities in Jammu and Kashmir in the name of freedom struggle. And while sentencing him to life, and mind you, the National Investigation Agency had pushed for death sentence for Malik, but court said that this was not a rarest of rare case, so death sentence would not be given to him. And while giving him life sentence, it said that his crimes intended to strike at the heart of the idea of India and were committed with the assistance of foreign powers and designated terrorists. So no leniency could actually be exercised in his case.
And apart from terror funding, what else has the NIA found out, or at least claimed to have found out, about Yasin Malik through this case?
Well, basically it's part of its own case, which it says that Malik, through all the terror funding that is generated in the name of freedom struggle, has actually created assets for himself. And it says that Malik has amassed properties of value which is in excess of rupees 15 crore. And all these assets and properties are there in Kashmir. And these include some 12 properties spread across, Maisuma, which is where Yasin Malik lives in Kashmir, which is just a few yards away from Lal Chowk, the famous marquee place in Srinagar, and places like Bohri Kadal, Bemina, Abi Gujar, Marigund, Kanipura. In all these places in Srinagar, he has properties. In fact, there are allegations of him having some investments in a mall near Lal Chowk and several other properties. In fact, there are allegations that he has grabbed both government property and properties of some Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir. His defense lawyers have always denied these charges and said that this is only an exercise to malign him.
Now, so far we have talked about who Yasin Malik is, the case against him, and why India had been engaging with him in the past. But now we talk about the significance of this sentencing. When we spoke to Indian Express's national editor of strategic affairs, Nirupama Subramanian, she told us that this sentencing of Yasin Malik is significant because it sends a signal that the government has now made a complete break from the previous approach of handling the Jammu and Kashmir issue.
By previous, I mean pre-2014. The approach that existed from, say, the 90s and well into this century up to at least 2009, when they held dialogue with Kashmiris, with Kashmiri groups, even with separatists. There was back-channel contact with mainstream politicians. There was a constant political engagement. All this more or less started petering out in 2014. With 2019, when the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act came into being and the special status of Jammu and Kashmir was taken away, and Jammu and Kashmir itself became 2 union territories, and everybody was put in detention, including mainstream politicians, separatists, everybody. 2019 was another signal that the way earlier governments did business is not our way. Now, this life sentence takes that argument a little further, that you may have given up your past, you may have made mistakes in the past, and you may have renounced militancy, you may have done all that, but we do not accept you.
She also points out that this government has not even engaged with mainstream political leaders. So former militants and those associated with terrorist activities is a different thing altogether. Plus, she says that for this government, it is also a matter of ideology.
This government has one of its very essential planks is that was always going to be the removal of Article 370. It's an ideological plank. Okay, and they had promised in every election that if voted to power, they will go ahead and remove it.
And this is what they did on the 5th of August, 2019. And like mentioned earlier, it was a long time coming. But before this happened, the BJP did try a different approach. In 2014, after it came to power, a state assembly election was held in Jammu and Kashmir. And in that election, the BJP allied with the PDP, that is the People's Democratic Party, which was founded by Mufti Muhammad Saeed.
This was really revolutionary and radical because the PDP in Jammu and Kashmir as well as outside, it is known as a soft separatist party. Their ideology is soft separatism, meaning they are not like Hurriyat, but among their constituents are people who subscribe to separatism. Also, the BJP then was making a compromise with its own ideology because a party that had such strong beliefs on article that there should be no compromise on Kashmir had then tied up with the PDP really to form this government. So from both sides, there was a compromise and it was hoped that they'd come together and this would lead to some kind of forward movement, dialogue with Pakistan, maybe with the Kashmiris. And this was all laid out in the Charter of the Alliance.
But this alliance, this partnership did not work out. Mufti Muhammad Saeed passed away the very next year, and there was also a sharp increase in violence in the region after the killing of Burhan Wani, who was the main face of militancy that time. Plus, Nirupama says that there were already tensions going on between the PDP and the BJP, because shortly after they formed an alliance, J&K experienced severe floods in which more than 260 people died. And the PDP alleged that the central government was not really addressing the issues that the state was facing that time.
This was a big complaint among the people, and this was a big complaint with the PDP, that they were not getting any money quickly enough to disperse to the people because it had been only 1 year after that huge big flood of 2014. Then with this militancy and with Burhan Wani, the rift started growing, and with the death of Mufti Muhammad Saeed, it probably grew a little wider, and the BJP even tried to break the PDP so that some people would come out of PDP and form the government with the BJP. So all this had happened. There was a history, and all this pointed to what was going to come.
And what was going to come was a completely different approach to the entire situation, which of course included the abrogation of Article 370, which meant that J&K could no longer have its own constitution, its own penal code, and the autonomy that determined the right of permanent residence.
That point, 2019, marked a new beginning as far as the BJP was concerned towards Kashmir. A, they had kept their promise of 370, of removing the special status, and two, that old way of doing business was dead. And that they signaled by jailing all the politicians and refusing to engage with them. There was a brief engagement when the Prime Minister met all these leaders, the leaders of the Gupkar Alliance last year around this time, I think in June. But apart from that, there has been no engagement.
Now, at a time when the approach has completely changed, it is worth looking at why the previous approach did not work. After engaging with Yasin Malik for so long, why did it not result in anything significant? Nirupama says that part of the reason is that Malik did not toe the line of the government. For example, in 1996, he boycotted the elections that the government had announced in J&K. Plus, his own popularity had gone down over time, especially after he denounced violence.
So in one sense, yes, there has been a consistent failure of the Indian state in resolving the Kashmir issue as a whole, not just the failure to make use of the opportunity that Yasin Malik presented in 1994. But there are various reasons for this. You can blame the Indian state's inability to keep its promise of concessions or acting quickly on matters that were being discussed. So on one side, there is that. But there is also on the other side that Pakistan never really cooperated in any peace process fully. It had one foot in the militancy, it had another foot in a peace process. And whenever some leader tried to start a peace process, it was always followed by a huge terror attack.
This included the 2008 bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul, and of course the 26/11 attack in Mumbai, which happened a few weeks after India and Pakistan had started cross-LOC trade from the Kashmir side. Nirupama also points out that after Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a surprise visit to his counterpart Nawaz Sharif in 2015, a few weeks after that, the Pathankot attack took place.
So what I'm saying is, yes, you can see it on one side as the failure of the Indian state, but there were many other factors. Militancy in Jammu and Kashmir, attacks in the rest of the country. So there were other problems as well.
But now with Yasin Malik getting life imprisonment, Nirupama says that the government wants to send a message on the ground to militants that this conduct is not going to be tolerated.
Whether it is today, tomorrow, or 30 years later, we are not going to forget and we are not going to forgive. So that is one thing. And the other thing, I think, again, from the point of view of the government, it tells the government to its own constituencies in the rest of the country that they are very hard. I mean, everybody praises Mr. Modi for being taking a very hard line. No nonsense. We will not tolerate militancy. We will not tolerate anybody who challenges the writ of the state. So in a sense, the government is playing to a constituency in the rest of the country as well. And elections are always coming. So these will be well used in the elections. It'll come up probably in a speech by Mr. Modi or Mr. Shah somewhere that, look, we are ready to deal with militancy with a stern hand. This goes down well among many constituencies in India now.
So this playing out well politically is one thing, but how will this affect things on the ground, Nirupama says, is another question entirely.
Because you can see that in 2019, the government said, today, we have with today, by doing this, by reorganizing Jammu and Kashmir, by removing the special status, we have ended terrorism. They put everybody in jail and there was no internet, there was nothing, but still there was recruitment, there were militant attacks, and now this year, militant attacks have only continued. There are more foreign militants today than there were at the same time last year, than all of last year. There have been targeted killings of civilians, both Muslim civilians, Kashmiri Muslims, as well as Kashmiri Pandits. You saw a policeman killed the other day. You saw a TV artist killed the other day. You saw Pandits being targeted, people going into that gentleman's office and picking him out and killing him right in his office. It's a government office. So things are definitely not better in the valley because 370 has gone. Terrorism continues, militancy continues, recruitment continues. So things are not going away. There is an underlying alienation, there are underlying grievances, there are political issues that the government has just not addressed yet. And they have changed the way they deal with Kashmir, or the Indian state deals with Kashmir, but that has not changed the situation in Kashmir itself.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.